So today we're going to start talking about third species. So you can actually see an example of third species on the screen here. The thing that you're going to notice is that there's 4 quarter notes to every whole note. So this is a 4-to-1 relationship. Now that 4-to-1 relationship can actually apply to a variety of different note values. You could have 4 eighth notes to every half note, or you could have 3/4 time where you have 3 quarter notes in a measure. But we always try and use whole notes and quarter notes when learning the basic voice leading, because it just simplifies things, and this is actually part of the tradition where it just simplifies the discussion of third species. Once you become more familiar with third species, then you can start to branch out and try other meters and actually use this in your own compositions if you want. So one of the things that you're going to notice, this is an example by Fux. So here we have this strong scalar passage that goes all the way from the D up to the E. That's actually going to be somewhat common in a third species counterpoint. There's going to be a lot of stepwise motion. If you look at this entire counterpoint, we have 1 skip, here's a leap, so we're not going to count that, there's 2, here's 3, so there's about 3 skips in the entire counterpoint. That's pretty typical. You typically only want to have anywhere from 2 to 4 skips. But you do want to include some skips because that creates variety in the actual counterpoint. Now if we look at our leaps, we have 1 and 2. That's also pretty typical. Typically you want to have fewer leaps than skips, and the general recommendation is anywhere from 1 to about 3 leaps. Most counterpoints will have at least 2 leaps, especially if it's going to be 11 measures long like this one. So you'll notice that we're in Dorian here, and we raise the leading tone, but the cadence actually includes 4 quarter notes. So this is a pretty typical cadence where you just move stepwise into the final chord tone where you get your octave. A few other things to notice before we talk about each one of these concepts in detail. The counterpoint in measure 9, it actually goes below the canus firmus. So when it goes below, notice that this is a third from the F, so F and A is a third. D and F is also a third. You want to make sure when you're counting your intervals, if you do dip below the canus firmus for a moment, you always want to use the lowest note to determine the interval. So D to F is actually a third, and it is not a 6. So that's really important. Another thing to notice, we have a unison here, and then we also have a unison on beat 2, another one on beat 2, here's one on beat 3, and here's one on beat 4. So we typically want to have a unison on a weak beat, unless it's the very first unison in the measure, or if it occurs at the end of the counterpoint. And truthfully, the only way it could end on a unison at the end of the counterpoint is if you're writing the counterpoint below the canus firmus. So these are just some of the topics we're going to be talking about. You'll also notice that the 7 going into a 5, some of you may have noticed this and said, oh, that's a mistake, you can't do that. And you'd be right, typically. But this is a special device that we're going to learn about today. It's called a Cambiata, and it's where you actually move into a dissonance, you skip down into a consonance, and then you actually resolve it on the final beat. So what's really happening here is we have an E, a D, and then it's resolving to a C. But in order to balance this skipping motion, we always want to extend it in the same movement, in the same direction, into the next beat. So we've got a Cambiata here, and I don't see any other Cambiatas, but this is something that we're going to talk about in a little more detail. So we talked about how third species uses a 4-to-1 relationship. Now that can be quarter notes, or you can start with a rest on the first beat. It's still a 4-to-1 relationship. So we'll notice that each one of these examples, you've got 4 quarter notes to every whole note. So you see there's 4 quarter notes here, 1 whole note, 4 quarter notes and a rest, whole note, 4 quarter notes and a rest. Now one of the things that you can do in third species, just like in second species where we started with a half note rest, you can actually start with a quarter note rest. So in this case, I've only shown examples of starting with a quarter note rest when it is below the canus firmus, but you can do this whether it's below the canus firmus or the counterpoint is above the Canis Firmus. Another thing you'll notice is that we're starting with a unison here, and we're just moving up by step. And here we're starting with an octave and moving down by step. So there's no real error that you can commit when you're moving by step and you start on a consonant. Here we have a whole note, and the counterpoint is below. So we start with a unison. So we end up with a unison, a second, and then a third, and we start with that quarter note rest. Here we have a unison, and then we start with an octave. It jumps into a fifth, and then it comes down into a sixth. So there's many different ways you can start the counterpoint, but the basic concept from second species and first species applies here. If the counterpoint is above the Canis Firmus, you can start with a unison, a fifth, or an octave. If the counterpoint is below the Canis Firmus, you can only start with a unison or an octave. And again, the reason for that is that if you start with a fifth below the Canis Firmus, and let's say we're in Ionian here with a C, then your note, your starting pitch, the lowest note for the beginning of the counterpoint solution is going to be an F. So all of a sudden, it no longer sounds like Dorian, it sounds like Lydian. So it starts on F instead of C. So we want to really emphasize the tonality. So that's why you have to start with an octave or a unison. Okay, so that's a really important concept. It's something that a lot of people get confused about. When we get into three-part writing, then you can start to begin with other intervals other than the unison, the fifth, and the octave. You can actually have a third or a sixth, but we'll talk about that at a different point in time. This is just dealing with two-part counterpoint, and there's specific rules for two-part. So now that we've talked about the passing tone in second species, we can talk about a new type of non-chord tone that can be used in third species. So now again, I want to make it clear, you're not supposed to use the neighboring tone in second species, but we can use it now in third species because we're dealing with this 4-to-1 relationship. So if we look at this first example, we have a third going into a fourth and back to a third. So this consonant tone, it just kind of goes up, visits its neighbor, and comes back. And while this one's ascending, you can also do it descending. So we don't actually have an example of this, but the E could go down to a D and then back up to an E. So I'm going to play this for you so you can hear it. So if I play that C and the E, very consonant. I don't know where it wants to go, but if I move up to the F by step, it suddenly creates a little bit of dissonance. And then if I come back down to the E, that dissonance is resolved. So if we play it in time, you can hear how that dissonance resolves itself. So you could also go down to a D instead of the F, so we get a second going back to a third. So you can hear how this neighboring motion creates energy in the counterpoint. And energy is what we're looking for. If we just had an E going to a G and back to an E, there's not any energy. It might even be nice sounding. We may even find that pleasing. But too much of this consonance would start to make the counterpoint feel really dull. And it would feel like the piece doesn't want to move forward. So the dissonance helps with that. So we could use a passing tone. We go from the E to the F to the G. Or you could use your neighbor tone to resolve that dissonance. So if we look at the second example, we've got an A and a C going into a second and back to the A, the third. That's another way of doing it. I could also go down into a fourth from the A to the G to the A. So there's different ways to use your neighbor tones, but the important thing is that you move up or down by step and then return to the original note. So what we're doing here is we're effectively prolonging this E and creating energy that pushes the piece forward. So I gave an example of passing motion here, just so you could hear that again in the context of third species. So if we have our C in the Canis Firmus, and then we have an E down here, if we go down into that seventh, it creates dissonance. And it needs to resolve, so we can just resolve by step into the C. So that's kind of ideal. So you'll notice that we want to try and have our dissonant neighbor tone either on the second or the fourth beat. When you have it on the second beat, it moves into a stronger beat. So that dissonance here in measure 1, that's a weak beat, and then it lands on a strong beat, which helps to somewhat emphasize that consonance. If you have the fourth on the third beat, then all of a sudden you are emphasizing the even weaker beat 4. So again, the third beat going into the fourth beat, where the third beat is dissonant, it creates an emphasis on our weakest beat in the measure. So that's why we try to put our dissonant neighbor tone on beat 2 or beat 4. A dissonance on the third beat needs to be used very sparingly. Fux actually talks about how you can have it on a third beat, and we'll talk about that later, but that's actually incorrect. It was just not characteristic of 16th century style. So if we look at this one, this is an example of how you could have the dissonance on the third beat, and I'll play it for you so you can hear how this C somehow becomes accented. It disrupts the natural meter of the line. So here we have our E and our C. Oh, sorry, an E and an A for a fifth. So it doesn't necessarily sound bad to our ears, but listen to it again. So what it does is it really smooths out the entire line. It loses some of the energy. So you're using that fourth and it's resolving to a weak beat, and some of the energy is gone. Compare it again to measure 1. That 3 we expect to be a somewhat strong beat. So that 4, it resolves nicely into a somewhat strong beat. So using the dissonance on beat 2 is really effective. In this one, it's emphasizing a beat we don't expect to be emphasized. We expect this next note to be the downbeat, but it's not, and it continues into a third. So we want to try and avoid that third beat dissonance whenever we can. So one of the things you can take away from this is that if you're using a dissonance, that's going to be used to create that forward motion, to push the piece forward. If you have a consonance, we don't really know where that wants to go. Where does this fifth want to go? It could go up to an A. It could go down to an F. It could go down to an E. It's really hard to say. Where does the second want to go? It either wants to go up to the E by step, or it wants to resolve into the C. So dissonance has more forward motion. And one of the things that you can learn from this is that if you use a dissonance on a weak beat like this and you emphasize an even weaker beat, then that's actually a technique you could use in your composition. If you want to disrupt the melody, you want to start a liquidation or a fragmentation of the melody, one way to reduce the expectations or to take away the expectations from the audience is to start using that fourth on a third beat. It'll be unexpected, and it allows you to create other deconstructions of the melody as you go. So these are things to kind of keep in mind, because when you learn the rules of counterpoint, then you can learn how to make balanced lines. But then when you come across an instance where you don't want it to be balanced, you want the music to be unsettling, you want it to be unpredictable, you can do the exact opposite, or somewhere in between. Maybe just take it one step away from what would be considered good and balanced melodies. So this is why counterpoint is so important, because it teaches you conventions that then you can break. So the next device we're going to talk about is the Cambiata. It's an Italian word, and it translates roughly into changing note, changing tone. And what it is if you look at this first example, you effectively have a consonant note that then moves into a dissonance, and then that dissonance doesn't resolve. So it would appear that we're leaving that dissonance unresolved, but that's not what's really happening. What's actually happening is we're having something very similar to a suspension in most cases. It doesn't always quite work this way, but there's sort of a 7/6 suspension, but typically you would see that 7/6 come down instead of the bottom of the canus firmus move up. So this isn't a true suspension, but it somewhat mimics a suspension where this 7 is holding over to the 6. But really, that's not even the resolution of the dissonance. The resolution of the dissonance is where it goes from beat 2 to beat 4. So this resolution from 7 to 6 using passing motion is just being delayed by a consonant interval that's being interjected. And so that creates imbalance, and it creates this sense that the counterpoint is kind of awkward, kind of off balance. So the way you correct it is once you get to this A, you use passing motion to get back to the C. So what you'll see is that in all of these, the 7, it holds across and becomes a consonant interval on the downbeat. Here we have a 4th between the D and the G. That 4th holds across and becomes a consonant in the next measure. Here you have a G and a C. That G is dissonant, holds across, becomes consonant in the next measure. So you always have this ascending motion or descending motion into the next measure. So we're going to talk about this one first, then we'll talk about these other two. So if we play this first one, we've got an 8, 7, 5, 6, and 6. It resolves itself. That C creates instability that is then sort of supported and resolved by that B. So I'm going to play this again. You got your 8, then your 7, your 5, 6, and the resolution. So what's really happening is this C is resolving to B with an ornamentation here. The G is resolving to A with an ornamentation here. The G's resolving, in this case, to an F sharp with this ornamentation here. So you want to make sure that your 8, 7, 5, and 6 are actually proper intervals. So what that means is the 8 needs to be a perfect octave. The 7th will be a dissonance, whether it's major or minor 7, so you don't have to worry about that. But then when you go down to the 5, you want to make sure it's not a diminished 5th, because otherwise that would effectively make 2 dissonances in a row. And there is a situation where we can have 2 dissonances on beat 2 and 3, but that's going to be the next slide. So we'll talk about that in a minute. So this, we want to make sure it's dissonant going into a consonant interval, and then it resolves to a consonant interval on beat 4. So if we look at this next example, this is actually a problem because we have the outline of a tritone. This F is going up to a B natural. And so what should be a consonant interval, this is a 6. It is a consonant interval. It's made dissonant by the fact that this F and this B will clash because they're the lowest and highest pitches in the line. So let's listen to this. Might not sound too bad to our ears, but listen to it one more time and try and hear this F and this B tritone relationship. It stands out more if I play this B as a B flat, if I change it to a note that's not dissonant, because F to B flat, that's just a perfect 4th. So let's listen again. Now compare it to the B natural, the tritone. That B just sticks out a little more because of that tritone relationship. Again, the B flat. So the B flat is smoother. To our modern ears, maybe the B natural sounds okay, but there is a relationship between the tritone here, and that makes this B natural stand out more than it needs to. It almost makes it more important than the F natural. When you turn it into a B flat, it's fine, as opposed to the B natural. So we want to make sure that even if the intervals are correct, we don't have anything like a tritone or something that makes the figure dissonant. The other thing I'll say is that the ascending Cambiata didn't really exist in Fuchs's book. He doesn't talk about it. It's not really permissible. So your counterpoint instructor, if you're taking counterpoint with somebody, might say don't use the ascending Cambiata. More modern counterpoint instructors like Seltzer and some of these other people that have written about the Cambiata, they'll say it's actually okay because essentially it's the same technique. But I do feel that anytime you descend, it's less emphasized. So if I go from 8 to 7 to 5, that is less obvious than if I go from F to G to B flat. There is more stress and tension in an ascending line. So it's important to talk about this so that you know why the ascending line is so often not used. But at the same time, experts in counterpoint say you can use either. It's just a matter of your preference. So just know that if you're using an ascending line, don't use it too often. And make sure you don't create sequences out of these. So don't do something like this where you have this first measure, I'm going to play it, and then I'm not going to create another Cambiata because I can't. If I go from C down to a B, it's a fifth, so that doesn't work. But I'm going to mimic the motion of this first measure. So I'll play C, B, G, A here. And you can hear this sequence. You want to avoid creating sequences out of these things. So as long as you avoid a sequence, you can use either one unless you're told not to. All right, so if we look at your interval patterns above, that means you can have 8, 7, 5, 6, which would be a descending Cambiata, or a 3, 4, 6, 5, that would be this one, which is ascending. Just make sure you don't have any tritones anywhere in your line. So this last one is another example. This is how you would write the counterpoint. If the cantus firmus was above, you'd use the figure 3, 4, 6, 5. So again, this is an example of, all the intervals work out through generic intervals, but this fifth is actually a diminished fifth. So we can't use it because what happens here is the 3 goes into a 4, which is a dissonance, and then the 4 would resolve into another dissonance. Again, you can't do that. So we want to avoid that. Let's go ahead and play this one so you can hear what it sounds like. It's really strong. It sounds like a cadence. So we want to avoid that because it's just kind of problematic with this 4 left unresolved until the second measure. It creates a really strong resolution though. So this is how you use the rules of theory. The rules are really guidelines, but this is how you use the theories that people have created. You see how this particular technique works. And so you know that if you go into a dissonance, you need to resolve it. If you don't resolve it, that creates this additional tension. So maybe you're writing a modern composition where you want additional tension. Now you know how to create it. And let's say you really want to create a powerful cadence. This 4 going to a 5 to a 3 where you have a diminished fifth here, that's really strong. So let's listen to it one more time. It really sounds like that's the end of the piece. So if I change it to an F, it doesn't sound quite so term ending. It sounds smoother. But then even here, if I turn this into an F natural, then I still have a slight relation between the F and the B. Again, that's not something technically wrong, but it may be deemed a little bit awkward. Yeah, I mean, changing this from a C to a B flat won't really help the situation because we don't have the mode in our ear. So we'd have to be firmly in Lydian to hear that B flat. But I'm going to change this B to a B flat and this F to an F natural, and you'll see it doesn't quite work because we're starting it on the A and the C. So we kind of feel like we're in Aeolian, and all of a sudden there's this flat 2 or this B flat in the piece. So let's do this. That would work if we were firmly in Lydian and we were used to the sound of Lydian, but it doesn't work in an isolated context like this. So the point is, you can use this Cambiata. Don't use it in a pattern. use these intervals, but then always check the intervals to make sure that the dissonance is truly a dissonance and the consonance is a consonance in relation to itself, so intervallically, harmonically, and in relation to maybe the first note or the lowest note of the line. So in this case, F to B, it makes this 3, 4, 6, 5 unworkable or less effective. So these are things you just want to kind of keep in mind. And again, anytime you learn a rule of music theory, guideline, it just shows you how to create music. So now we get to talk about the dissonant double neighbor. So what this is effectively is it's two neighbor tones that are interspersed and intertwined with each other. So if we look at measure 2 here, we're going to avoid measure 1 for now. You'll notice that you have this G, and it holds throughout the measure to the other G. You'll notice in the next measure, this D, it kind of holds and is ornamented by these two notes in the middle, but it ends up on the D at the end. So here, even this one, you have a C to a C, and this one you have an A to an A. So what this neighbor tone is doing, or this double neighbor, is it is actually ornamenting the first consonant note at the beginning of the measure. So what we really have here is this G comes down to its lower neighbor, the F, and then it returns to the original tone, the G, after skipping a note. And then here we have a G, it skips a note to get to its upper neighbor, and then it comes down to a G. So here again, you've got your consonant tone, an upper neighbor, and a return to the original pitch. And then you have your second neighbor, which is the consonant tone going to the lower neighbor, the C, and back up to the D. So your dissonant double neighbor is a way to create dissonance on beats 2 and 3. And this is actually one of the instances where we would want a dissonance on beat 3. So again, we're going to talk more about what Fux said about the dissonance on beat 3, but generally it wasn't used in the 16th century unless it was used in a technique like this. So what this does, it creates a little bit of ornamentation. One thing you want to do though, is you want to make sure beat 2 and 3 end up being dissonant with a lower pitch, because what you're doing is you're creating this energy and you're creating this really strong resolution back into the original pitch. So let's go ahead and play measure 2 so you can hear what it sounds like. And then it resolves back to that G. So you can hear this third going into the second, which is really dissonant, a fourth, which is a little less dissonant, and then back to the 3. So it creates this motion in the melody. Remember, we're always talking about this energy and this motion that dissonance creates. So if we look at the next one, it's doing the same thing. We're starting on an octave, going into a ninth, down to a seventh, and then back up to an octave for its resolution. If we look at this measure here, we have an example below. Again, dissonance on beat 2 and 3. So let's go ahead and play this. So you can hear how that dissonance charges the original A and propels it forward into its resolution. And then our last one. So you can start with an upper neighbor or a lower neighbor, but then all you do is you have a skip of a third that, both these notes have to be dissonant, and then it comes back to the original pitch. So here's an example of what you need to avoid. Let's play measure 1. The problem with this is that we have a dissonance, which is great, but then we skip into a consonance. So in some ways this is acting a little bit like a cambiata in this instance, but it's not a true cambiata because we're not getting a true resolution. So you're going to hear this and it's going to sound just a little bit awkward. See, it doesn't have that same pull back into the A. This is good, and then this is not so good. Now compare it to the second measure, where we do get two dissonances. I'll play measure 1 and then measure 2. Here's measure 2. That, the return to the original consonant pitch is more powerful in measure 2 than it is in measure 1. So let's listen to 1 again. It's like, okay, we're back to the A, but it doesn't have that pull into the A. Measure 2. So that's a better resolution. Another example is an example of starting with a consonant interval and then skipping into a dissonance. This is also a problem. So I'll play this measure for you starting on the C. That 7 kind of comes out of nowhere. It's unprepared, so it's more unbalanced. It doesn't have the same kind of effective energy as when you have 2 dissonances in a row. So essentially what you do is you start in a consonant pitch, typically a third or an octave, and then you move into a dissonance through lower or an upper neighbor, and then you skip a third in the other direction, and then you resolve to the original pitch. So I always thought of this kind of like a snake just kind of inching its way around. So if we look at measure 2 again. So that's your dissonant double neighbor. It's probably one of the most commonly used patterns. It's really effective, but as with anything in counterpoint, don't use it several times in a row. We want to avoid creating patterns with the dissonant double neighbor, or really any of these. The Cambiata, the dissonant double neighbor, any of these special techniques that we've now talked about to emphasize your counterpoint and create more variety in dissonance. So let's talk a little bit about the cadences. So if the canus firmus is below the counterpoint, these are the most common cadences. There are other options, but in the beginning just stick with the conventional cadences, and then you can get a counterpoint text and learn about some of the other options. So you typically want to use the intervals 3, 4, 5, 6, and an octave, or 8, 7, 5, 6 octave if the canus firmus is below the counterpoint. So here we have 3, 4, 5, 6 goes into an octave. So this is our pretty standard cadence. It sounds like a 5-1 in inversion. So let's look at our next example. It starts on the D and the D octave. This is your 8, 7, 5, 6 example. If the canus firmus is above the counterpoint, you only have one option. So here is our 3, 5, 4, 3, 1. You wouldn't want to have an octave here because that would put too much space between the two intervals. So here, if we had an octave distance, this fifth would become a 12th. Remember, we don't want to have more than a 10th between the two counterpoint and canus firmus parts. We want to keep it within a 10th. The only place you could have a 12th is at the high point. So even then, it should be avoided unless it's absolutely necessary. So let's go ahead. These cadences are just something that you should memorize. So make sure that you have the leading tone. In this case, since we're in Ionian, I don't have to make the B sharp, because a B sharp would be a C. But if we were in, for example, Dorian, you'd want to make sure that 7th scale degree is raised so you get a C sharp. We need to have that major chord at the end of the piece when possible. So the use of unisons. I talked a little bit about this, but you can use unisons and they should occur on a weak beat. The only exception, again, is going to be the very first note of the piece, or if you end up with a unison and you're writing the counterpoint below the canus firmus, you can have a unison at the end of the piece. In fact, it's probably going to be required. So you also want to avoid using them on beats 1 and 3. Here is an example where Fux actually uses the unison on beat 3, but he does it sparingly. It only occurs once in the entire counterpoint, so he can kind of get away with it. Typically, you want them to occur on one of the weaker beats. And while the 3 is a weaker beat than 1, it's still stronger than 2 and 4. So we like to put the unisons on the weakest beats in the measure. So if we look at this example, that octave jump here, the unison's on a weak beat. Here, the unison is on a weak beat, beat 4. Beat 3 is the only place where it's not in a weaker position. So here we have it on beat 2. You'll notice nowhere in the counterpoint except for the first beat there is a unison on beat 1, so avoid that. Another thing that's a little bit interesting is we switch sides here. So the counterpoint actually goes below. So let's talk about that. So in measure 9, which I started talking about in the last slide, you actually leap below the canus firmus. So we have a 3 here and a 3 here. You can do this, and you can actually stay below the counterpoint, or I'm sorry, the canus firmus if you want to. So you can actually turn your solution that started out above into a solution that ends below. There are examples of that in their literature. More typically, you go below very briefly and then you come back up, like we have here, measure 9 to 10. So it's okay to go below if you want to. The important thing to remember is that if you go below, you have to use the lowest note to figure out the interval. This is a mistake students make all the time. So we have a D and an F. We want to use that D to figure out the intervals. So D to F is actually a third. This would not be a 6. So in general, if the counterpoint is above the canus firmus, we want to stay above. If the counterpoint is below the canus firmus, we want to stay below. And we should just have brief moments where we maybe go above the canus firmus. So unison is now allowed. Remember, in second species, we really didn't want to use it at all. And in first species, we definitely didn't want to use it, except for the first or last measure. So there are some issues because Fux didn't really write about 16th century counterpoint. He was living in the century that followed, and so there are some things in there that are sort of a mix between 16th and the newer style that was coming in the 18th century. So some of the things to keep in mind that we typically don't want to have any dissonance on beats 1 and 3. Now you noticed how he actually did have a dissonance on beat 3. This third beat dissonance that he describes, where you have 1, 2, and 4 as consonant tones, and then you just have the third beat that's dissonance, that's not actually characteristic of the 16th century style. So if you're trying to be really particular and write in 16th century style, then you want to avoid that third beat dissonance. Since Fux does use the third beat dissonance in his textbooks, typically your instructors would allow you to use it. Just know that it's not characteristic of the 16th century style. So if you're trying to write something, a composition that's truly medieval in character, or 16th century, style, Baroque style, then you probably would want to avoid that dissonance on the third beat. Wouldn't even really be medieval. That would be a completely different style. All right, so another thing to keep in mind is stranded dissonances. These dissonant harmonic intervals that are not properly enclosed by stepwise motion through either passing or neighbor motion. You just want to avoid that. So you can have it with a cambiata. That is a stranded dissonance because that octave comes into a seventh and then it skips down into a consonant interval. That dissonance didn't resolve right away. That's an exception because it's a special technique that can be used. But in general, you'd want to avoid that. So just watch out for your stranded dissonances and you should be okay. Here are a few melodic considerations, just general guidelines to help you write a more effective counterpoint. So an accented beat is going to be sort of beats 1 or 3, the beats that are heavier in the measure. You want to avoid accenting skips from an accented beat. So if you go from beat 1 to 2, you generally don't want to have a skip there. You tend to want to have your skips going from a weaker beat to a stronger beat. Descending skips are less of a problem. So if we do something like this, I go from an E down to a C. That's less of an issue than this, E up to a G. That E up to the G, it puts an emphasis on the second note. You can hear it, right? I'm going to play it down here. Even though the first beat, the E should be the stronger note. That G is getting the priority. It's creating a lot of motion. So that G naturally gets accented, and it takes away the natural meter of the counterpoint. So we want to avoid that because that creates imbalance. If you go down though, it naturally weakens the second beat. So descending skips are okay. Okay, so the disconnect is a line that skips a third or more and continues in the same direction. I see this all the time in counterpoints. So let's say we start in our C, we go to a D, and then we skip to an F. That just sounds awkward, right? So we want to avoid that. If you did skip like that, you'd want to use a cambiata so that it kind of resolves back and fills in that note it skipped. So we want to avoid skipping a third or more and then continue in the same direction. So again, if I play C, D, F, and G, that's continuing in the same direction. It's awkward. If I take it and go the other direction, it's a little bit better. So we want to avoid the disconnect. It's just awkward and we try and avoid it. Don't repeat any notes. That is actually a strict rule. There's very few things in music that are rules, but when it comes to counterpoint, you don't repeat notes because it just creates this awkwardness in the melody, and it almost feels like you're skipping or tripping over your feet. So if you want a high point, it should be on the first or third beat of the measure, ideally the first. We don't want a high point on the second beat, so just keep that in mind. We want to put that high point in a prominent place, so we want it to be on the first beat or the third beat. And ideally, the high point should be consonant with the final, which, remember, that's the starting pitch of the mode. So it should be consonant with a C in Dorian, or a C in Ionian, or a D in Dorian, or an E in Phrygian, or an F in Lydian. Okay, so we want to keep our high point consonant, but it's not a strict requirement anymore because we're moving so quickly. All right, so let's just talk about treating your octaves and fifths real quick. So you want to place 3 intervening tones between consecutive octaves and fifths. So if we look at measures 3 to 6, here we have a fifth, or here it's our octave, and then there's our other octave. So we have 3 notes in between it. That's good. So here we have a fifth and another fifth, 3 notes in between it. So these are not actually considered downbeat to downbeat parallel octaves. These ones are actually moving in contrary motion because the C is coming down to a B and this C is going up to a D. This one is similar motion, but these 3 intervening notes in between, they kind of make the ear forget. So you can have this, but just make sure that you have 3 intervening notes between any fifths or octaves that would otherwise be consecutive. If you have 2 intervening notes, you want to avoid emphasizing the octave or fifth with a skip or a leap. So if we look to measures 7 and 10, here we have 2 intervening notes here, the 7 and the 6. So we should avoid this because what we're doing is we now have emphasized that octave. So if I play measure 7, that really emphasizes the octave. So it brings attention to the octave because of that leap, and that makes this more problematic. Same thing here. We have an octave and an octave with only 2 intervening notes. Both would be problematic. If you said 7 was worse, you're right. So this also goes back to that previous slide where I talked about how you want to avoid a skip, definitely a leap from an accented to an unaccented pitch. This kind of shows you how that really emphasizes the second beat. So downbeat to downbeat octaves and fifths are okay as long as the octave or fifth isn't emphasized with a leap, sequence, or distinct device. So here, if we look at measure 11 to 13, we have a sequence. This is a series of cambiatas. So we start with an octave, it's becoming very monotonous, predictable. We want to avoid that. But you'll notice in measure 3, which is essentially the same thing, this is okay, but that's because we don't have a sequence starting in measure 4. So we want to avoid any kind of device. So a series of double neighbors, a series of the same interval patterns, anything that creates a pattern and becomes sequential like this, we want to avoid, especially if we're using downbeat to downbeat octaves or fifths, okay? Because that makes them even worse. So then here's another example. This one should be really obvious. You got the C and the C, that's an octave, going into a D and a D. This is actually parallel octaves. A very specific type of similar motion and the worst type to have because it just creates this complete transparency. There's no motion. So let's go ahead and play measure 1 and 2. You hear that? It's very archaic sounding. So let's play through all these. How about measure 3 and 4? See, that sounds better than measure 11, 12, and 13 because I didn't create a sequence. How about measure 5 and 6? This one's okay because we're moving from a dissonance into a downbeat of a fifth. This is skipping, but the other line's moving by step. So remember, anytime you have a skip or a leap in one part, the other part should move by step to even out that skip or leap. If both of these parts were to skip into the downbeat, that would be a little bit awkward and problematic. So let's look at measure 7. It just really emphasizes that octave. So how about measure 9 and 10? Not as bad because we don't have that leap, but it's still something you should avoid. How about measure 11 to 13? That one should be avoided because it's a sequence. Any type of sequence, you've got to avoid it, especially if it involves 8 to 8 or 5 to 5 on the downbeats. So we have one more guideline to talk about, and it's sort of known as the 4 quarter note rule. The other one, the 3 quarter note rule and the 2 quarter note rule, those are really for those of you that can remember the information on the previous slide and understand how these subtle differences between these 3 rules actually work. So with the 4 quarter note rule, this is how you're safe. This is how you can avoid making any sort of mistake with your octaves, your unisons, or your fifths. So if you place 4 consecutive quarter notes between any consecutive unisons, fifth, or octaves, then you're fine. You won't make any of these mistakes. Because if you think about it, if you put 4 quarter, let's say you have an octave on beat 1, you then put in 4 quarter notes, your next octave is going to be on beat 2 of the next measure, so no error can be made. With the 3 quarter note rule we talked about before, you want to place at least 3 intervening tones between consecutive octaves and fifths, and that's another way to kind of be safe. But then you may have a skip in there or something that makes a line just a little bit awkward. So that's why you have to be a little more careful with the 3 quarter note rule, because you can still make mistakes if you're skipping into that octave or that fifth, or skipping away from it even. So then the 2 quarter note rule, you want to avoid emphasizing the octave or fifth with a skip or a leap. So that's another way where you can kind of get away and bypass this 4 quarter note rule. So the 4 quarter note rule is how you stay safe. 3 and 2, you have to treat with a little more subtlety, and you really have to listen to what it sounds like with your ear, because generally with 3 quarter notes intervening and 2 quarter notes intervening, it's not going to be as effective as the 4 quarter notes. Because again, we don't want to emphasize these transparent octaves. That's an octave right there. Or these transparent fifths. So that's it. I hope you enjoyed this, and the next time that we meet for Counterpoint, we're going to be talking about fourth species, the final species, and also in a lot of ways, I think the most interesting and easiest species to complete.